It often comes about that the dawning of a new era brings with it some mythology which tells what one may expect from that era which is to follow. We observed this fact with the Grail myth, which sprang out of the 12th century and told us so much about modern man. So much valuable, powerful insight may be gained from the mythology of our time if one has the ears to hear. So also, the same era, 12th century approximately, gave us another myth, and that is the myth of Tristan and Isolde, which says so much about where modern man is now. And again, if we have the ears to hear, we can gain great insight and information from our relationships from this age-old myth. It has so much wisdom to tell us. One can make something of a case for the fact that much of the era which we are now bringing to a close had its origins about 12th century. One can argue various delineations of history, but I'm particularly fond of the one that so much of our age began in 12th century. Many of the winds from which we are reaping whirlwinds now began then. At the first wind, which often blows through the collective unconscious in the form of mythology, one can learn something of the genius and the storm which is to come from it. I'm particularly delighted with symmetries when I find them. I find some hope, courage, encouragement, and strength from symmetries when I find them. And there is such a symmetry from the time in history which we're speaking of now. And two statements were made saying something of the depths of that time, one a theological statement and the other a mythological statement. One is known as the Catharist heresy, which sprang up in this rich time of history, and the other is the myth, which we will study this morning. Both are saying the same thing, which is the thesis of my talk, and both are infinitely rich to me. The 12th century was an enormously powerful and rich time. Gothic architecture was springing up over Europe. Peter Abelard founded the University of Paris. A bit later, Thomas Aquinas was to make his great works which dominated the Catholic Church for centuries to come. It was a powerful, powerful time. Somehow it thrills me. It sends chills of joy down my back that the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris, that magnificent great soaring of stone, was built by a city of 70,000 people, barely the size of Santa Barbara today. That was a sign of the time. That was the age that we're going to address ourselves to. They thought enough of the Spirit so that a small town, 70,000 people, could raise something as magnificent and as great and powerful as Notre Dame of Paris. Christianity was in full sway. The disaster of the Reformation had not yet touched, though the rumblings of it were afoot. And something happened of great importance and power, something difficult for us to comprehend now. It was an invasion of ideas or points of view from the Eastern world, probably via Eastern Europe, probably via Persia, possibly originating in India, or being the introvert that I am, I like to say that it originated in the collective unconscious and came bursting forth in the outer form which we will look at. That idea, point of view, attitude, which came from the East, was something like this. The Eastern world, contrary to Western thought, feels that man is essentially God. and that he has lost his way, and that the true import of human life is to recover one's godhood, to remember one's way, remember the fact that one is God. An extraordinary idea to Western ears. This came bursting out through history, through dissemination of ideas via Persia, or perhaps it was just time for that evolution to touch Western man. Anyway, it burst forth at this time. Christianity essentially holds that man and God are utterly separate beings, and that the proper relationship of man to God is the mystical marriage. Or, as the book of Revelations holds it, it is correct that at his highest, man shall kneel before the divinity and chant, "Holy, holy, holy." The Western idea is that a worship, a relationship shall be set forth between God and man. The East says that an identity shall be established between God and man. Man shall become God. I'm remembering the sayings of an Eastern sage, a Hindu sage, who sits in his monastery or his ashram at the top of a hill. The lightning and the thunder is playing around at the top of the next hill during the monsoon season. And the lightning flashes in the mountain, and the sage says, "I lightning." And the thunder claps, and he says, "I thunder." There's no difference between God and man to the Eastern sage. A touching example of that, which has come into our own culture now, was an experience that a friend of mine had. She's a white-haired, dignified, gracious woman. She had dokusan, or an interview with a Zen Roshi. She came in, prostrated herself properly before the Roshi, and burst out, and she says, "I have no business here. I don't know what to ask. I'm not worthy of this time, and I think I should go now." And he said, "Stay." And she trembled. And he reached out his hand, and he said, "Shake hands with me, please." So she timidly shook hands with him. And he said, "Well?" And she said, "It is time for me to go, please." He said, "Shake hands with me again, please." So she shook hands. And he said, "Well?" And she was speechless by this time. And he said, "Don't you understand? God has shaken hands with God. Now you may go." Well, she never entirely recovered from it. And we have never entirely recovered from the invasion or the influx or the genius or the enlightenment, however you wish to call it, that came from the East beginning about this period in our history. Man is God, according to the Eastern view. One more example of this, which touched me to the core. Fortunately, I had read in Rabindranath Tagore's work that it is the custom in India that one person may approach another person, possibly even a stranger, and through the proper ceremonies, ask that person in all dignity and in the best consciousness possible, "Will you be the incarnation of God for me?" And should the person agree, which he is duty-bound to do unless he has very specific reasons otherwise, a relationship is set up in which that person becomes the living incarnation of God for one. In due time, if one's development proceeds, one will discover for oneself that one is also the incarnation of God. In fact, that there is not but God walking on the face of the earth. This is the wonderful, terrible, awful stuff which is in India. I was in India and cut something of a spectacular figure in the little village where I came to live. They had never seen a white man before. So when somebody came to me and asked me if I would be the incarnation of God for her, I was absolutely speechless, which turned out to be exactly the correct reply. So I was saved. And she took my silence to mean assent. So I felt as if a bell jar had been laid down over the top of my head, and I had the awesome duty of playing the incarnation of God for someone, which is an awesome thing to have happen to one. I in no way took it lightly. I tried to digest this and do the right things with it and not do the wrong things with it. It was a very easy role because it is a prescribed role. That's one of the great joys of India, that every situation in life is prescribed for one, and there is a correct and knowable way to do anything that might happen to you. There's no personal exchange between people who have entered into such an arrangement as that. And one has only to be quiet. I learned that art some years ago, so that was all that was required of me, and I did my duty. I was in India for many months, had grown used to, as best a Westerner can, to some of these things that happen to one. And by a long series of events, I was left alone in the city of Calcutta for some time, for many days. And Calcutta is probably the worst place in the world. Calcutta, and I was alone. The only place I've been alone in India, I wonder what fate arranged that, was getting me down. It was too much. I couldn't stand the rickshaw drivers trotting between poles, taking me somewhere, so I didn't take rickshaws anymore. There are no taxis. I grew weary of walking. I was in a poor place which was noisy. I couldn't hole up there. I got weary of stepping over the corpses in the streets, or soon wondering whether the body I had just stepped over was a corpse or not, or halfway in between. Mothers thrusting ill children into my arms. That was too much. I was left raw and vulnerable to the awfulness of India. I needed somebody. I needed some help. I needed something desperately. I knew no one. I was perfectly safe, but I was overwhelmed inwardly, and I needed help. What does one do in Calcutta? I remembered one has the right to go to another human being and ask him to be that extraordinary thing for one which one needs at that moment. Having something of the courage of desperation within me, I went out to a park. I looked about, I looked at people, and I chose a middle-aged Indian dressed in traditional dress, in no way extraordinary, but he looked intelligent. He looked compassionate and he looked wise. Perhaps I was introjecting all of those things into him. I'll never know. But I chose him and I went up to him. I asked him, "Sir, please, do you speak English?" And he said, "Yes." And then I took my Indian privilege and I said, "Will you be the incarnation of God for me?" And he looked at me and he said, "Yes." And I burst forth, and I don't think I drew breath for 20 minutes then. I told him who I was. I told him what anguish had fallen into me, that it was too much. I couldn't stand it. Finally, the storm that I laid upon him diminished, and I was all right. He had indeed done what I asked him to do. I regained something of my good manners, began to recover my ability to be polite and courteous. I asked him, and, sir, please, and who are you? He told me his name, which is unpronounceable and unrememberable. And I said, and who are you beside the incarnation of God? And he said, I'm a Catholic priest. Of all of the people in all of Calcutta who I might have tagged to play the role of Jesus Christ upon the face of the earth, I had unwittingly chosen a Roman Catholic priest. I went away speechless, but healed, and I don't know how he went away. I don't know who he is. I have no way of finding him again, but it is so. I think this lecture began in that experience. When I could think again, it began to dawn on me, this is not so strange. We in America do this frequently. We ask each other to be the incarnations of God for each other, but we haven't got the courage, we haven't the information, we haven't the strength to do it with dignity. So we do it indirectly, and we get into a most terrible mess with it. We confuse levels, we ask somebody to be the incarnation of God for us, and then we add many other levels on top of, around, and under this, and tangle the whole thing up into the insoluble tangle which so much of the 20th century is. It is my thesis this morning that Tristan and Isolde, having drunk the magic potion which we will hear soon about, invested each other with divinity and didn't know what to do with it. And we don't know to this day what to do with the divinity once we have drunken of that precious stuff. So a little bit of background now for our myth. This great impact, this impulse, came from the East, went rushing through the unconscious of the Western world, appeared principally as those heresies which are now called the Albigensian heresies, simply because they revolve so much around the southern French town of Albi, from which we get our word Albigensian. The Catharists were one of the most interesting of the Albigensian sect. Now, in order to understand the Catharists, we must look at a curious and powerful and too often forgotten psychological fact. And that is that when one goes from one era of one's life, or society goes from one era of its life to another, the rules are often changed as if exactly set on their head. Example of this. I accompanied a woman once who did beautiful professional work, had a good life, managed well, an exemplary person, and suddenly she entered the next section of her life, a very profound one, and to her utter amazement found almost all of the rules of her life changed as if dropped upon her head. It was then that I came across the medieval proverb that says that God is constantly dropping one on one's head, which is to mean that when one changes from one era of one's life to another, it's as if one has been dropped on one's head and everything is turned upside down. A quote from Dr. Jung on the subject. This is from the Kundalini seminars, quoted in Spring Magazine. The power that forces you into consciousness and that sustains you in your conscious world proves to be the worst enemy when you come to the next center. For there you are really going out of this world, and everything that makes you cling to it is your worst enemy. The greatest blessing in this world is the greatest curse in the next. The upside-downness of it. This woman could no longer drive a car. She could no longer stand to go to the market. She couldn't work any longer. She was upside down. And it was my task to assist her through that period of time. After much shock, we determined that we had to obey the new rules which had fallen upon her, and we simply set about to obey those rules. No driving, no work, no market. She could go to Mass early in the morning, but scarcely anything else. I acquainted the people around her with what had happened, protected her, buffered her between her and her world. And after a year or a bit more, people became used to this, and there was very little difficulty. We settled down to the kind of life which was required for her. At the end of approximately 2 years, God saw fit to drop her on her head again. And the rules were once more changed. She was suddenly prepared to work. She was out. She was busy, and has led a most extraordinary and creative and productive life ever since. The Cathars in the 12th century were people who had literally been dropped on their head by the new era which had fallen upon them. The power of the East which had come to them reversed so many of the laws of their life. They abhorred sexuality. They did not marry. They did not have personal possessions. Any power was taboo to them. Almost everything which is conducive to life, as we call it, seemed to be forbidden to them. A new era had fallen upon the Western world, and these people, in their strange way, knew what to do with it. They simply ignored almost everything which we call life process. They wished to be cured of that illness known as life, and death was the highest goal that they could put forth. They practiced what they called the enduro, which was fasting unto death. They simply would stop eating so as to stop this nonsense which was called life. I don't think that was very often practiced, but it was held as an ideal. They fasted often in any case. It's such an extraordinary thing to observe what people do when they undertake a religious or a spiritual quest. They seem to diminish all of the life processes as we know them. Sex is forbidden. They eat as little as possible. If one practices yoga, one breathes as little as possible. One has no possessions. One is refused speech. And one would think that they are obeying the laws of death more than they are the laws of life. They simply are obeying the laws of the Spirit, which seem much akin to the laws of death to us when viewed from our point of view. The Catharists and the Albigensians in general issued forth into one of the extraordinary times of our Western history, and that is the age of the troubadours and the courtliness of that period of time. The troubadours practiced a fashion of taking their lute, going forth, wooing fair maiden in a court or wealthy household, because this practice was largely confined to courtly or aristocratic houses. Woo fair maiden, win her heart, and leave. They would go to another castle, woo fair maiden, win her heart, and leave. This is very much like some of the exotic techniques which one hears about in India of tantric yoga. It is the practice there to establish a very powerful exchange between a man and a woman and stop it or thwart it just at the apex of its energy cycle, to harness that flow of energy which has been constellated and put it into the service of the spirit. This is what the troubadours were attempting to do. They were using the things of the world to power the things of the spirit. Well, the church got hold of this, of course, and didn't like it at all. It was quite counter to Christian point of view by definitions which I gave you earlier. Innocent III finally decided that this was to be branded as a heresy, and he set the Albigensian wars afoot to stamp this heresy out. I'm delighted with the definition of heresy which I came across once. The definition is that a heresy is a truth which is pushed a bit too far. I was instantly interested because here is a possible access to some truths, to see the heresies of the world, and if one has the wisdom to keep them in proportion, one might learn something of great depth and value. The word heresy comes from the root meaning to choose. And Christianity doesn't very much like one to choose in the world of the spirit. We may have our visions, and we may be canonized long after our death, but during our lifetime we are not encouraged to choose. The heresy was branded as heresy. The Albigensian wars were put forward. The heresy was stamped out, which of course only means that it was stamped under. And there are some of the winds of which we are reaping whirlwinds in our own time now. So, this is far too brief a survey of that period of time when our myths sprang forth. It is my thesis for the morning that the myth of Tristan and Isolde is saying precisely the same thing as the theological statement which we have been talking about now. That is a symmetry which I stumbled onto and which pleases me so much. Being of the temperament that I am, myths tell me much more than theology does. So, we can look at the myths now. Tristan is born to a king, and his father dies before his birth. His mother dies at birth. And Tristan is left alone, and he's given to a commoner to raise for his own safety, so that the people who had killed his father might not find him and kill the heir to the throne. Tristan is raised in most disadvantageous circumstances, and somebody who has a difficult history can take heart from this fact, that a difficult birth and a difficult growing up is the lot of the hero. All heroes come in this fashion, and I hope you will recognize your own heroic way within yourself. Those things that are so painful to you are the stuff of the hero within you. Tristan grows up. He finally is taken to his uncle, King Mark. They discover each other, Tristan comes into his own realm, is made powerful, and takes his true place of kingship in his world. King Mark's father had been ravaged by the Morholt, which came yearly from Ireland, and asked for the best maids and the best youths of the land, and took them away as hostages or as tribute. And no one was strong enough to stop this. And the land simply lay under this spell. Tristan arrives and asks to fight the Morholt, fights, is very badly wounded, but kills the Morholt. And curiously, a little chip of his sword is left in the Morholt's head. So the evidence is in the wound of the Morholt and the missing chip in Tristan's sword. Tristan is very nearly killed by the encounter. And he has to have the extraordinary healing, the only thing that can heal him from this dreadful wound which he has. And he knows how to be healed of such a wound. He puts himself in a small boat without oar and without sail, and shoves himself off into the sea and waits for fate to touch him. The fate will take him to the cure that is required of him. It may be the cure of death. It may be a cure which will continue his life, but he sets himself at the mercy of whatever cure may come to him. What an extraordinary way. What a prescription for the cure of life. I'm remembering a dream of my own from many, many years ago, when at dusk I was taken down a flight of steps to the water's edge, and I was told how one becomes an analyst. One lies flat on the water, hoists a tiny sail from his navel, and abandons himself to go wherever the wind will take him. So I lay down in the water, raised my tiny, insignificant little sail at my navel, which began to blow me away from the shores, and I was trying to keep up my courage in the face of whatever was going to happen from then on. And this, the dream said, is how you become an analyst. In the myth, that is how you find your cure. It's an audacious thing to ask for cure in that particular manner. The boat landed on the shores of Ireland. Tristan finds himself in the court of the Queen of Ireland, ennobles himself in the face of the court and the people by saving them from a dragon which is marauding the land and the court. The Queen, with her magic power, heals Tristan, and he is ingratiated into the court of Ireland. Isolde, daughter of the Queen, discovers one day that the chip which she had taken from her uncle, the Morholt's head, at his funeral, exactly fits the vacant place in Tristan's sword, and she understands that it is Tristan to whom they owe so much, that they also owe the death of their uncle, the Queen's sister. Tristan is in a considerable dilemma over this, but she is beholden to Tristan, so she says nothing. Tristan goes back to his native land, serves his King Mark, uncle. A bird, a swallow, has brought a hare, a black hare, and King Mark understands that the hair is from the head of his future bride. And Tristan, his beloved and his trusted, he sends out to find the owner of the hair to bring her back as Mark's bride. Tristan goes forth and by magic means finds the owner of the hair, who is no less than Isolde. He announces that Isolde shall return with him and be the bride of King Mark. Isolde is beholden to Tristan, and she's also angry with him because he is the killer of her uncle. They set forth. The Queen of Ireland, who has the healing power, who has the magic power, sends a magic vial with Isolde's servant maid with the instructions that King Mark and Isolde are to drink the love potion, the magic vial, when they are married, and this will wed them together and join them together indissolubly forever. The ship sails, is becalmed, a particularly hot day ensues. The crew is all ashore somewhere. A maidservant is hunting for something to slake the thirst of Tristan and Isolde, stumbles onto the magic potion, and serves it to Tristan and Isolde. The magic potion now is functioning between Tristan and Isolde, not between King Mark and Isolde. And the two are irrevocably in love with each other. And they are wedded and united in a bond which cannot be broken. And therein is the hinge of our story. Tristan and Isolde have entered a new realm. They have been dropped on their head. And what they don't understand and never accomplish within the whole rest of the story is that all of the signs have been changed. The laws of their lives have been reversed, and they are not aware of the fact. And I wish now to shift imperceptibly, because it is not difficult, to the 20th century, and observe that when the fate of Tristan and Isolde falls upon us as modern people, all of our laws are changed. We are in another realm, and we serve a different principle. Tristan and Isolde did not know this, and in that fact, they are portraying or foretelling the dilemma of our own time. When we are touched with the divine fire which is by chance fallen from heaven, in that experience we call falling in love, we observe a different master, and we are in a realm requiring different laws than those we ordinarily follow. And this is the genius which the myth can tell us if we will hear it. The love potion in many ways is another of those frequent experiences of breaking the Garden of Eden. Nothing works the same anymore. In our own time, and that's what I'm basically interested in now, we have grown so clever and so smart and so insulated that our loves are almost the only language God has left to touch us. And you know perfectly well from your own experience and those of your neighbors that almost the only time they are touched profoundly is when a love experience comes to them. It is our most powerful modern language. Look at our literature, which so often uses the language of the 12th century troubadours, and see where our values lie. It is so often in a Tristan and Isolde love that we are touched, if we are to judge by the modern poets and authors. It is the interjection of passion into our lives, and we have almost totally forgotten the origin and the meaning of passion. Passion means suffering, it means submission, and more than anything else, it means finding something greater than yourself and serving that greater than oneself. Someone said that our love experiences are a foretaste of the transfiguration, which is a foretaste of the resurrection. There are several things that Tristan and Isolde might have done at this moment, when the divine fire falls upon them. They could do what they did, which I suspect is fateful, and there is no other way, and that is finish out the whole myth, which is largely one of agony. Or they could have followed another Isolde later on, Cordelia in Shakespeare's King Lear, and love and be silent. That's one possibility when the divine fire has fallen upon one. To love and be silent. To do nothing about it. Not to try to translate it into any of the terms which one is daily familiar with. If the laws are changed and most of the signs are reversed, one can keep still. This is one possibility. India solves the problem by keeping the divine fire in the temple and never allowing it into any personal experience or life. I've seen Hindus go to the temple and in ecstasy before the god Shiva tremble and shake and go into an ecstasy and go into a passion in the truest sense of the word. They are in the presence of something greater than themselves, and thrilled to the bone with it. That is another possibility. In India, the love experience, the in-loveness, which we're so familiar with, never takes human size or proportion and is never brought into a marriage. The marriage is a quiet, calm, disciplined matter and is in no way designed to take the passion of life. And India never asks of his spouse for the meaning of life or to be thrilled or to be pleased or to be warmed. He asks of his wife or she of her husband that they do the duty of marriage and the prescribed things which the ancient laws of India prescribed for them. And they ask nothing more. That is until the Indians began reading our novels and see our movies. And now they're adopting our ways at great rate. The third possibility is a meditation on divine image, as the Hindu does. He takes his divine fire to the temple and never asks a human being to carry it for him. Or one may do the rituals and put the fire into something sufficiently impersonal so that it can hold it. The feudal Japanese customs had a startling prescription for people who should fall in love with each other. The prescription is that they shall go to a high place, find a cliff, and jump off together. Or if one does not have the courage for that, go to a high place, part ways, and never see each other ever again. Come back and ask of man what one can legitimately ask of man, and ask of God what one can legitimately ask of God, but don't mix the two, please. This moment in the story of Tristan and Isolde is the introjection of passion, we might call it enlightenment, into our everyday, ordinary life. The love potion was designed for a king and a queen. It was drunk by two ordinary mortals, and they did not hold it very well in their history. It's very interesting to me that the love potion was brought to Tristan and Isolde by the maidservant. It is in Romeo and Juliet, another statement of this story, that it is Juliet's maidservant who nudges the two lovers on to the catastrophe which overcame them. One can find the maidservant in our own society now. We are all legitimately hungry for the experience of passion, the experience of something greater than ourselves, something that will thrill us to the bone, something that will touch us to the quick. And our whole advertising world is playing maidservant to us now by serving us up in small ways, legitimately or not legitimately, with the promise of passion. Look at any television commercial or virtually any advertisement, and one is being told just around the edges that if you will only do what this advertisement prescribes for you, that marvelous, superordinate, passionate, wonderful world will enter your household again and banish the dreariness of your life. The myth goes on, and there's very little bit trouble in the myth for the rest of the time. Tristan delivers Isolde to his uncle, his king. Mark and Isolde are married. Isolde substitutes a maidservant for herself for the wedding night, and then has the maidservant killed because she knows the deceit which has gone on. Tristan and Isolde see each other frequently, but always undercover, and we learn that one of the characteristics of romantic love is one of these reversed signs which we've spoken of, that it prospers only under prohibition. Romantic love is sweet only when it is forbidden in some sense. Tristan and Isolde see each other often. Friends tell King Mark what is going on. King Mark sends spies, but Tristan and Isolde manage to cover their tracks. Finally, King Mark finds out that it is true that a love affair is going on in his own house with his own wife. He banishes Tristan and keeps Isolde. Isolde manages messages to Tristan. Tristan comes back, and he sees Isolde. King Mark banishes both Isolde and Tristan to death. Tristan escapes, and instead of death, Isolde is given to the lepers, a fate worse than death. They manage to come back again to the court. Tristan is at a distance. Isolde is taken back into the court. They have lived in the forest for some time, and the hermit Ogren has convinced them that they should go back to the court and live honest lives, return Isolde to her king, and Tristan to whatever fate he is to go to. And they go back. Isolde is to be tried by fire, an ordeal, a way of discovering justice in those days. And she is to be asked in the face of the fire if she has ever been in the arms of anyone but her rightful lord, King Mark. They arrange that when she is getting off the barge to come to the place of inquiry, she should slip, and Tristan, dressed as a mendicant, shall pick her up and carry her over the mud to the place of inquiry. So she can rightly say, when the question is asked, "No, I have never been in the arms of anyone but my lawful lord and king, Mark. Oh, except, of course, the beggar man who just took me from the barge." And she has not told a mistruth. And when the fire is put upon her, she is not burnt because she has not told a mistruth, and she is saved. The story goes on. Tristan leaves. I hope you'll go and read this story at length and search out the many, many rich details of it. It is chiefly the love potion which is occupying us this morning. The rest of the myth is a very, very rich experience. Please go and read it. Tristan rescues a kingdom from a dragon and is given Isolde of the White Hand in marriage for his troubles. He marries her, but he repels her on the wedding night and will have nothing to do with her. There's more deceit. Romantic love is full of deceit. It seems that when the fire of heaven falls upon one, and one is not observant of its laws, one is no longer able to follow the laws of our ordinary world either. One can say that deceit is obeying two different sets of laws at one time, and the whole myth is full of that. Our whole life is full of that now. When the divine fire falls upon us, we're no better prepared to take it than was 12th century man. And it is time we began learning some of the laws of the interior life. Tristan marries Isolde of the White Hand, and he fails this marriage utterly. Strange, two marriages of importance in the story. One, a kind of heavenly marriage of the spirit, Tristan and Isolde, and the other, an earthy marriage, Tristan and Isolde of the White Hand. I've been searching for a way of talking about the second kind of marriage. The first is easy. It is the falling of the divine fire upon man. And I have found nothing better to describe the second kind of marriage than the terms of a very good friend of mine. And she says it's stirring the oatmeal love, the ordinariness, that which one is relegated to and which one's love seems to cool down to only too quickly, of the duties, be it the woman's duties or be it the man's duties, stirring the oatmeal love. And there's a specific human love which, if one has been dazzled out of one's eyesight by the divine love, one is very apt to miss, and is being missed many, many times in modern marriages now. There is a specific human love, not based on romanticism. I watched this love in operation in India and sat in marvel of it. It is stable, it is disciplined, it goes largely by ritual and by law and by structure. There's very little romantic about it, but it is a thing of very great beauty. And those people don't ask of each other what they may not legitimately ask of human relationship. And they don't disappoint each other. They have a stable marriage. They raise beautiful children from such a marriage. I remember a young woman who came to me. She was in a dilemma between two men. Should she marry this one or should she marry that one? It's already trouble if one is puzzled over should one marry this one or that one. And she said, this one, the most unreliable fellow, but he takes me almost every evening down and shows me the seals. And he's a beautiful person. And the other one is a reliable man, and he earns well, and he's really much farther up in the world. And she didn't know which one to marry. I ran into her on the street a year or so later, greeted her. Yes, she had married. Which one did you marry? I married the other one. But he never takes me to see the seals. And there is Tristan and Isolde in 2 sentences before us. She had both loves, and she didn't know what to do with either one. It is my thesis that one of the chief difficulties of our marriage of this time is that we have 2 loves mixed, and we don't know the laws of either. My friend who told me the marvelous phrase of stir the oatmeal love says that human love consents to stir the oatmeal. The divine love doesn't even need oatmeal. The romanticism, our capacity for falling in love, is only a partial accomplishment of a new revelation. Its partialness is the problem. We're set in the middle of a paradox. We know divine love, and we know human love, and we're stuck absolutely in between the two and don't know what to do with either, or especially the relationship between the two of them. One of the greatest sins that a human being can commit is to betray the paradox of one's life. Truths come in pairs. It simply is made that way. And if one denies the doubleness, if one denies the pair of truths which fall upon one's life, one has denied truth itself. The ultimate statement of this that I am aware of is the theological statement that Christ is half man and half God, or it was once corrected and told, it is really all man and all God, but he is of the nature of both realms. And that is one of the statements of the paradox. We are in our own paradox of 2 kinds of love, and we must be loyal to both. And Tristan failed one of them utterly. He refused Isolde of the white hand, and he refused, on that level at least, his statement of truth. But what if they had done better? What if they had been wiser? It's dangerous to tamper with myths because myths are what they are. One approaches them with awe and reverence. But what would have happened if Isolde had been married and loyal to King Mark, and Tristan had stayed quiet and, like Cordelia, love and be silent? The suffering would have been the same. The suffering would have been as great, but the story would not have been the tragedy which it is. If a man can do both loves, and we are now stuck with both, there's no putting the clock back. We can't be Hindus and put the love back again. If he can stay with both of his truths, his in-loveness and his stir-the-porridge kind of love, if he will stay with that, there's a good chance that finally he will discover the divinity of the woman that he did marry. Speaking of this, every time I open this material, I wonder about Mrs. Dante. History only records that there is a Mrs. Dante and that she had 5 children. And that's all we know. And what a life she must have led, always in the shadow of Beatrice. And there are the 2 loves, and as far as I know, Dante was loyal to both. It is possible. I think perhaps Dante was lucky because Beatrice died soon after Dante first saw her, and he could worship her in an interior realm. And he could found a family, and worship the other half of man's truth in an ordinary marriage and 5 children. If somehow one could put the divine in the temple, that would make a human relationship with Isolde of the White Hand possible. But Tristan did not. Tristan makes his way back to Isolde again. Everything goes badly. Tristan is wounded. He's wounded fighting a dragon. I'm always touched by how much time all heroes seem to spend recovering from dragon wounds. Only Isolde can heal Tristan of this dragon wound. And he sends a message that Isolde shall come to him. If the ship returns with a white sail at the top, it means that Isolde is aboard. And if there's a black sail, Isolde is not aboard. The ship comes back with a white sail, and Isolde of the White Hand reports to Tristan, "The ship has come, my lord, and it bears a black sail." Tristan in despair dies. Isolde disembarks from the ship, finds Tristan only dead a few moments, and dies herself. That is the end of our tale. Interesting to observe that as soon as there are 4 players in the drama, it can come to its conclusion. It can come to a transformation. I have 2 possibilities for the myth in general, and that is that it is the suffering, it is the tragedy which heals the wound of the magic potion. That seems to be the one we fall into if we remain unconscious of the material at hand. Or the death at the end can be taken as a symbol of transformation. I've been working at the Tristan and Isolde myth all of my adult life, and I had presumed that it came to such a dreary end. I had to live with that for many years. Then I came across a Hindu version of Tristan and Isolde, which taught me something new and brought me up sharply to another level from which I could view our own Western Tristan and Isolde. And in half a dozen sentences, I'd like to tell you the Hindu myth. It's worthy of more, a little now. It's a story of the transposed heads. It seems that a girl fell in love with 2 men who were very close friends. One of the men had a great, strong, marvelous body, was a little dim in the head. And the other one had a little, scrawny, meek body, but a magnificent, wise head. She fell in love with both, and they had a bad time of it. They were all loyal, each to the other, and no one quarreled, but they realized that they were in a dreadful dilemma, and that there was, in a way, no solution to this. A fine body and a dim head, and a slender body and a fine head. So, what were they to do? The 2 men, staunch, close friends, decided that the only thing to do was to make a great sacrifice. So they each went to a glade in the woods, and each cut off his own head to make the sacrifice. And the poor girl came onto this scene just a few seconds after it had happened and saw the disaster of her life lying there in a bloody mess in the glade. And she implored the gods and goddesses so fervently to help her in this terrible, terrible disaster that the gods did hear. And they told her, if you put the heads back on quickly, the men will be saved. So she quickly put the heads back on, and of course, completely by chance, she put the wise head on the beautiful body, and the dim head on the little scrawny body, and they thought all was solved. No one had thought of this alternative to the dilemma. It went on for some months quite happy. Only an Indian could be happy with this. And they began to notice that disaster was overtaking them again, because the fine head was weakening the beautiful body, and it was growing scrawny. And the dim head was growing a magnificent, muscly, handsome body, and they were back in the same dilemma all over again. And they saw that there was no solution, so they built a large funeral pyre, and they joined hands and jumped into the funeral pyre as a solution to the matter. Well, that bit of a story woke me up, and I saw that Tristan and Isolde leads to transformation, not to disaster. We can look at Tristan and Isolde as that almost infinite suffering which one's deepest loves almost always draw one into, or we can look at it as the progression toward transformation, death being the transformation. And I think it is saying very simply, both myths, that the solution to the insolubility of one's divine loves is to transform. That pearl of wisdom is there for us if we have ears to hear. Now, to sum up, we have said lengthily this morning that mankind has gained a new faculty, the faculty of in-loveness, the faculty of seeing the God or goddess in another person. And he's doing very badly with this new faculty. We can learn much from the East in how to manage this faculty because they have known it for long these many years. But we don't choose to go that route. I doubt if we could, with the best of will, turn the clock back and try to follow the Hindu model. I'm profoundly impressed with the Hindu model, but it is closed, at least to me. It doesn't seem to work very well for anyone that I know. One searches about for a possible solution to this divinity which has fallen upon the head of mankind, and that he seems so ill-equipped to meet with anything except the most profound and abject suffering. I would like to bring a dream to you, which I think offers, probably more powerfully than any argument I could bring forth, a possible solution for this. It is a dream of a man in his early 30s, and I will read the dream for you exactly as it is written here. I am carrying the bell which once belonged to the Virgin Mary to the great basilica which has been built centuries ago to house it when it was found. The shape of the bell was known, and a niche has been prepared over the altar exactly the correct size to fit the bell. The priest has been on duty at all times for several centuries to accept the bell when it was returned. I walked into the basilica, down the long aisle, and presented the bell to the waiting priest. Together we lifted it up and hung it from the hook in its niche. The bell fitted its place perfectly. The priest had been instructed to go to the west end of the basilica to ring the great bells in the towers to announce to the world that the bell had been found and returned to Christianity. The great bells had never sounded for all the years of their life, but waited until the day when the bell of the Virgin Mary had been returned. I sat on a bench by the side of the altar while the priest hurried the length of the basilica to ring the great bells. What should I do? Should I wait and claim all the fame and adulation which would come to me as the discoverer of the bell of the Virgin Mary? Or should I slip quietly away and avoid all the involvement? The priest, in his excitement, had not looked at me, so I could still claim anonymity. I decided on the latter. Just as the great bells began to ring, and the populace of the town began to rush toward the basilica, I slipped out a side door and began my solitary journey out of the city. Here is an answer to the question we are asking, which comes welling up from the very deep places of the unconscious, and it speaks directly through the dream of a modern person of what we are to do. I would like to look at the dream in some detail. The dream of a young man in his early 30s. He is hit with the story which we are talking about. His unconscious replies. He has the bell of the Virgin Mary. Now, what in the world is any mortal human being doing with the bell of the Virgin Mary? This is holy stuff and does not belong in the hands of mortal man. It is a bell. It means that which is to sound forth and to be known. Bells aren't silent. And it once belonged to the Virgin Mary. Somehow, the matter we are speaking of this morning is a very feminine matter, and I suspect it is going to be feminine wisdom which will lead us out of the problem we're in. It will be the bell of the Virgin Mary which has something to teach us. I wish I had time and the scholarship to lay out before you the fact that the cult of the Virgin Mary, or at least her appearance in the world of art, took place in the 12th century. The Church has always known that something which essentially belonged to Christianity would be returned to Christianity one day. The size of the bell is known. A basilica has been built. A place has been prepared for it, a hook to hang it on, and the patience to wait for centuries and centuries and centuries. A priest has been on duty for centuries and centuries and centuries, waiting for the return of this bell, the great treasure of Christianity. And here comes this poor mortal man under the weight of the bell, trudging along the dusty highway. And he has the good sense to return it to something bigger than himself. Remember I said that passion consists of consenting. It means finding something greater than oneself and consenting to that greatness. He consents to it, and he puts it in a place which is strong enough to hold it, a basilica. The basilica is there, it is ready. And then what is he to do personally? What would Tristan have done if he had known about Cordelia, and when he had discovered that he had the magic potion in his being, he had followed Cordelia's manner and love and be silent? Like this man, he would have gone out the side door very silently, very anonymously, and taken his fate off with him. He would have left the divine part of himself in the temple, and he would have left the human part of himself in absolutely human dimensions, and he would not have mixed the two. For the whole burden of the dream is the fact that he differentiates the two, the divine part of himself and the ordinary, as I called it, oatmeal part of himself. The dream is genius in that respect. How does one do this? What does it mean? how does one take that divine part of oneself? How does one take the bell of the Virgin Mary, which one never asked for in the first place, but one seems to have somewhere tucked in one's arms or on a shoulder or one's back? What does one do with it? One returns it to the temple, if possible. It's well known that Dr. Jung used to return a patient to his family or ancestral religion as quickly as possible, if that person could do it. He would send a Catholic back to his confessions, and he'd send a Jew to the synagogue. And I think there's a story of his sending a Parsi once back to his native roots. This is the simplest thing to do. If one can find one's way again to the temple, the basilica, the synagogue, the traditions of one's ancestry, this is certainly the simplest possibility of solution. But there are people who can't do that. There are people who have strayed too far. Individuation or individuality or that wonderful, awful, divine, fatal stuff of consciousness and intelligence has gone too far with them, and they cannot put their precious burden back into the temple again. There are such people. Then one must find a temple of some sort in some dimension, and thank God there is an interior temple which is open to us. That is much more difficult, it's much more solitary, and one is quite likely to be let out a side door into a dusty road and led off into anonymity as far as one's own personal life is concerned. A man who I've now forgotten coined a proverb or a phrase which saved my life once. When I read it, I shed off an enormous burden. And the proverb that he devised was, "All personal lives are failures." And I thought, do you mean to sit there on that page and stare up at me and tell me that other people's lives are failures, not just my own? And the page answered back with the proverb, "All personal lives are failures," because they are personal. The personal realms are small, and we take that to be failure. They're not, but it seems so. And I think that's why people resist putting the bell back in the basilica, because they think there will be no sheen, there will be no delight, there will be no ecstasy in life ever again, which is not true, because the bell is safe, and the basilica is you. So with that comment from the unconscious, it's as if the unconscious has answered the unconscious, the only possible answer which I'm aware of. I would like to bring this to a close now. I presented to you the barest bones of a great issue. I've taken some small delight in teasing you with so many questions and opening so many avenues, which I hope will spark us off at 2 o'clock this afternoon, when there will be a further discussion of this matter, and 3 o'clock or shortly after, when questions will be welcome. So, good morning now.